Thank you so much, and I very much hope that you enjoyed your field trips. I, for one, I went to the TV tower, Mr. Prime Minister, and just stepped off the bus onto the stage. So we just made it here on time for a lovely session called How Great is Europe? How Great is Europe? Wonderful title. This is my first time in Estonia, so I don't know if this is indicative of dry Estonian humor. The How Great is Europe, implying that Europe is great. This is, I think, that's what we're implying here. We just need to determine within the next 90 minutes how great it is. And for that, I have a wonderful, distinguished panel. The gentleman to my right, of course, is none other than the Prime Minister of this beautiful country that is hosting us for this great conference. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Prime Minister Jüri Ratas. I'm delighted to welcome a member of the Latvian Parliament. She's the chairperson of the European Affairs Committee there, Lolita Čigane. He is the Vice President and Executive Director of the German Marshall Fund of the United States. He also heads the Berlin office of the GMF. Thomas Kleine-Brockhoff, ladies and gentlemen. And last but not least, he's, of course, the Polish Secretary of State for European Affairs. Delighted to have him here, Konrad Szymanski. Mr. Prime Minister, how great is Europe? That is the question we want to address here today. Now, I want to give you all the opportunity to kick it off on a positive note, because I'm pretty sure that the problems and obstacles will come up fairly quickly. And implying that Europe is great, Prime Minister, why is Europe great?
Because 79% of our population, they said that Europe is good, positive. I hope also the great. I could see so many positive aspects, and the question is always, what is alternative? And especially here, I think, in Estonia, Baltic region, I couldn't see any theoretical and practical alternative for our states. That is, I think, the most concrete answer to you. Of course, there is a lot of question about the economy, free movement of people and goods and services and so on, the currency, what is very strong for us. I think there is also very good economical figures last 3, 4, 5 years. I think also this common understanding today, even we have the Brexit on the table and very strong lesson the rest of the EU countries. I think this unity is my emotion, I mean, around this EU Council table, that all of the leaders, they understand that it is only one way to go.
79% of your citizens are pro-European, are extremely positive.
If we are talking the research from Estonia and different research, the last figures was 79, yes.
Right, quite a high number. Not sure, how does it look in Latvia? Why is Europe great?
For us, Europe is great because it's cool. It's not great like the past greatness or grandeur of Napoleon type. It's great because it's cool, it's dynamic, it is able to overcome crisis. And it is moving ahead. And it is also great, as in cool, because it's the leader in fighting climate change. It definitely is the leader in fighting waste and introducing new measures of waste management, of really struggling for privacy on internet, and that is cool. And there are so many cool things about the European Union, and I think the coolest is the fact that the European Union is the project that has made us believe that we can move beyond our history and we can leave the past acrimony behind us.
Yes, please.
And that is what makes it great.
Estonians believe Europe is great. Latvians believe Europe is cool. What do the Germans think?
Well, I can tell you what I can tell you what I think. To me, Europe is an idea that I feel at home, and it's the idea of universality and democracy and human rights. That, to me, is Europe. That's where I feel at home.
The values that that you're placing the emphasis on.
The normative element of it. There's a cultural feeling of home, but that feeling can only be lived within an environment that guarantees those things.
The German side is placing value and emphasis on what binds us. Konrad Szymanski, give us the Polish view of how
No,
great
I
Europe
can
is.
only subscribe to all things already said, but I would like to add one more thing. I have also the same privilege as Prime Minister Ratas to live in a country which have no doubts about the European integration and represent the government which hasn't any fundamental doubts about the integration. It is a question of the rarity around the table in Europe, because we see what kind of change, political change, we witness today. But I would like to say something more. It's of course great. Europe is great, no doubt. But this great concept has a major problems with implementation today, major crossroads ahead, and these major problems poses an existential questions of the future and existential risk for the future. I think, and this is the, at least from my perspective, it's the whole picture. It's great, but not only. It's a great concept with some major problems.
Could you be a bit more concrete? What problems are you referring to?
No, we know where we are in some capitals. I think we have a problem with the incompleted common market. We completed the market about goods and finance, and it is good. But with the movement of people, we still have some hesitations, at least in some capitals. We have a major, fundamental, and rising hesitations about the common market of services, which is the major thing from our perspective, the Central European perspective. We couldn't complete the internal market in 2005, and now we have even a major wave of protectionism under the European flag, which is something new, which would propose a reverse steps on internal market of services. I'm talking about posting, about international transport. It's a major risk. Of course, we have some other problems with the Eurozone contradictions between North and South. We have an unresolved problem with the European response for migration. It all should be probably responded during our conversation, but I think it's worth concentrating on the right answers for the nearest future, because this problem is not granted anymore.
Prime Minister, from the outset, it seems to many that the European Union is in a constant crisis mode. It has been for some time. Many of the aspects have already been mentioned: the financial crisis, the migration crisis, Brexit, all of these things. Now we have a current occupant of the White House who clearly doesn't think much of the European Union or their positions. As an EU leader, as somebody who is a member of the European Union, which ones of those which ones of those problems do you think are the most pertinent, are the ones to be tackled first?
I think if we could learn from crisis, that is very important. And if we take this crisis, for example, this recession or euro crisis, I think today, after these years, European Union is much more stronger, and also much more better experience and preparation is much more stronger. You mentioned about the United States and in the EU. Of course, on the one hand, I think we all understand that these transatlantic relations with the United States is strategical, is very important for EU. And what do we want? We want to live without these tariffs. Today, the second day, I mean the 2nd of June, we understand that this temporary solution, what we had, for example, in May, is now over. And now it's, my opinion is, of course, we are making our steps. But of course, we would like to find this solution, what will be positive between the United States and Europe. I think it isn't very normal that these transatlantic relations are going down, or we cancelled it. I think it isn't any solution from EU side. The second lesson, I think, is also this Brexit, what you mentioned. For example, it was in the beginning of last year, when 27 leaders, they were in Rome. And we made the Rome Declaration. It was 60 years of Rome Treaty. And I think it was very strong and concrete influence inside the European Union that these 27 countries, they would like to go forward together. And I think one of these good lesson for us is today Brexit. That no one no one putting on the table this kind of issue that we are the next exit. I could say that today we haven't this kind of exit questions. I could guarantee last 18 months where I have the possibility to be around the table.
You think the way the negotiations are going from the British perspective is deterring others from following suit?
When we started the negotiations, then the one goal was that these 27 countries, they must be united. They must act as a team. And today we could say that we have only one negotiations between EU and Brexit, not, I don't know, 27 negotiations between United Kingdom and Brexit and EU. But of course, I think all these 27 countries, they also understand that after the Brexit, we also need normal relations with United Kingdom. And I really hope that we could find the best solution both sides.
Before I move on, just a quick assessment, because you can hear the talk also in the corridors when it comes to Brexit. There's still some people here, also in the audience, who believe that this thing is reversible. Do you count yourself amongst them?
I am very sad about the Brexit, and I really hope that in the final day we could find a solution that the EU is going forward 28 countries, not 27. But of course, I understand that the people from the United Kingdom, they made their decision, and today is the situation like we have.
Lolita Cigane, if you look at the European Union, if you look at the current topics that we're talking about, many of the obstacles and issues that have been mentioned, which ones are giving you the biggest headaches?
One thing that we have to understand is that the European Union has always been, and probably will always be, work in progress. So it is, by its essence, incomplete. 2015, huge migration crisis. What we saw was that we created so-called Schengen area. But not that we forgot, but we didn't manage to really achieve concrete solutions on border management. So we had problems with our borders and how we guarded our borders. As a response, we strengthened the Border and Coast Guard Agency, Frontex. They have a much more expanded mandate. We have actually border guard on reserve in every EU member state now. And there are actually emergency procedures if there is a wave of, for instance, migrants in one EU member state. They can call, first of all, for help to others. And if they do not manage as an extraordinary procedure, we can just go and help them. This should have been created when we created Schengen. It's obvious. But we didn't manage to do it because guarding your borders is part of your national pride, so to say. So this is one incomplete one very good example of this incompleteness. Now, when we are talking about potential economic crisis, of course there are things that are incomplete. For instance, we haven't completed the banking union. And there are many analysts who are pointing out that we have to strengthen the euro management. We have to strengthen the banking union. There are concrete things that we should be moving ahead to make sure that we are less vulnerable when the next crisis hits. Unfortunately, often we are achieving the concrete needed solutions only when the X hour comes, and then there is a late night summit, and by the early morning hours, all of a sudden we see that there is a movement forward. I hope this doesn't happen as a response to the potential next crisis. We've done quite a lot to respond to the previous one, but not enough.
But a common approach to handling and solving the migration issue, as you pointed out, is certainly something that seems to be on your mind as a priority. Something, of course, the Germans know very well, particularly after 2015, as far as the influx of refugees are concerned. Thomas Kleine-Brockhoff, I know you're not here in the capacity of the German government, even though you were a long-time advisor to German President Gauck. But I would still like to get your view. German oftentimes being looked upon as the leader, as the one to be carrying this union forward. Is that too much of a burden?
Yes, it is. This is the union of 28. I'm concerned about the dual challenge that Europe is facing today. One is I've grown up with the idea of dual integration. of integration into Europe and integration into transatlantic structures. And you see serious fissures in both. You see a transatlantic relationship that has an American outlook that is seeing itself no longer as the guardian of the international post-war order, but is led by a president who either doesn't care about it or is actively undermining it, who, certainly not only as of yesterday, seems to confuse allies and foes. The second element is the inner European. The inner European fissures that post-2015 have not been overcome. We still have the dual dividing line between East and West and North and South. And currently, I would say we're seeing a historical window closing. And that window has been opened by French President Macron in his Sorbonne speech. I'm concerned about the non-answer, the European non-answer to that speech. I have not seen 27 other prime ministers or heads of state respond, and I'm most concerned about the fact that I haven't seen my own government respond to it in an appropriate way. Now, we all know the constraints, we all know the political calendar, we all know those restrictions, but certainly with the Italian election and the new Italian government, we're looking at a changed picture and a changed, the time of the ability to move forward on something that Mr. Macron is proposing is closing now. The Chancellor is preparing an answer. And what should that answer include? In my view, it should include a massive German investment in common structures. Former Foreign Minister Joschka Fischer said last week, and I like that quote, a budget surplus won't help us, won't make us happy. In my view, we should invest into Europe, into transatlantic structure, and do that in three ways. One, Eurozone reform. There needs to be the acceptance of the basic fact that the Maastricht Treaty was passed in 1992, and we still have not completed a governance system that includes transfers between countries. Right. Germans hate the term transfer union. I would like to remind them that they have signed a treaty in 1992. Second is a Schengen and a Dublin system that addresses two things. That ameliorates, especially Eastern European concerns about border control and migration control, and still upholds the idea that Europe is a country that has signed the Geneva Convention, and still upholds the idea that Hannah Arendt told us that there is a right to have rights, that there is people who have a right to knock onto the door and receive a hearing. And thirdly, I would like to see an investment in common defense. We all know the problems of that. This is an ongoing debate in my country. But those three things would go a long way in stabilizing and investing into those three things, in overcoming East-West divisions, in overcoming North-South divisions, and reinvesting into dual integration. Now, you're going to ask the next question, anybody, is how realistic is that? You know, this sort of, is there going to be a big leap? Well, not very likely. You will rather, I think we're just coming to terms with the depth of the political crisis in Germany. The election results have produced a government, but they've also produced a very immobile state. And this immobility is going to be a constraining factor on any of these three things. So my guess would be what we're seeing is typical German incrementalism, and Merkeling on. But that's not that we're getting nothing out of this. So this is what I hope and expect, especially from the next months and from then on forward.
Right, but in essence, you just put forth 3 proposals, all of which you think are not implementable due to the German position.
No, I think the Conservatives have a problem with the Eurozone piece. The Social Democrats have a problem with the defense piece. And on migration, the picture is mixed. But you're going to get incremental progress on all of these. So the picture is not completely bleak, but it will, of course, depend on whether the Italian situation is putting the brakes on everything or whether the Italian situation does the opposite. It brings in an extra player, that's the markets. And not only would it, as Mr. Oettinger so said in his unfortunate remarks, educate the Italian voter. No, it could educate especially the French and the German governments about what's at stake.
Mm-hmm. Seems like you're going to run for office soon. This is, you certainly have your agenda laid out, that's for sure. Konrad Szymanski, Thomas Kleine-Brockhoff started his statements by focusing on values. And many in the European Union, certainly Günther Oettinger seems to be one of them, doesn't think that your administration, that your government currently is abiding by those EU values. On the contrary, that they're undermining those values and us proposing certain schemes, financial repercussions and so on and so forth in order to bring countries like Hungary and perhaps yours in line. Give us a sense from your country when you hear these kind of things. Do you feel vilified in an unjustified manner?
So it only means that we have more than one unnecessary remarks by Commissioner Oettinger. The second one on Italian electoral behaviorism, and the first one, indeed, about the possible or alleged clash of values inside the Union. It is not true, and it shouldn't be defined like this, because we have no controversy at all about values. Warsaw and Brussels believes in the same set of values, strongly in the same sense. The rule of law value is a value of Polish constitution, so there is no doubt that we do not make any controversy about values. But indeed, we have a controversy about the interpretation of values and the implementation of values. This is something natural. We have that kind of clashes in constitutional courts of every single member state frequently, and this is the case. Of course, it's a pity we have to maintain and continue this unnecessary and politicized time to time and defined sometimes like you did as a major problem. We have to continue this controversy. We would prefer to close this controversy. That's why Prime Minister of Poland decided to propose more than 20 amendments to address the European Commission's, I think, ungrounded but maybe legitimate concerns. So we are on the track to close it, but I would like to stress it very strongly. It is not a clash of values. It's a clash of interpretation, which sometimes happen in democracy. But what is more important from my perspective is at least one of the remarks made by my predecessor about the silence after Sorbonne. I think the very fact that some governments were pretty silent after Sorbonne's speech of President Macron doesn't mean that we haven't an answer. And I think specifically the silence of the German Chancellor is very telling and very illustrative. I think it's pretty clear that there is no any kind of acceptance to bring divisions into the Union from the German side. This is what I understand from Berlin today. And even more important, at least from a German perspective, it is not definitely our part of the problem, but there is no any kind of acceptance for the transfer union. And I think especially the first answer, the strong opposition to bring unnecessary divisions to union, is a very right answer of Chancellor Merkel to the Sorbonne speech of President Macron, if it would be understood like this. I'm not sure about the intention of President Macron. I don't want to define in such a strong way But if there are doubts about the intention of Paris, about the unity, I would agree and I would subscribe to the Germany's silence about it, because the last thing we need is the division of the Union. Divided Union means that Europe is weaker, and that's all. The unity is exactly what we need today to safeguard our economic interest in the world, trade interest, to preserve our socio-economic model, etc. Divided union means weaker Europe, and this is the last thing we need.
A unified Europe is essential to tackle the problems, says Konrad Szymanski, Prime Minister. And indeed, if we look at the challenges, the tariffs imposed by Donald Trump, the US bailing out of the Iran agreement, and every time we hear this mantra, Europe has to remain unified in order to tackle these challenges. Now, never mind the Brexit, but just from this little chit-chat, you see that there are, of course, some misunderstandings, and as far as values and perceptions are concerned. When you sit down with your 27, soon to be 26 counterparts, this unity that everybody on these panels and in press conferences is always subscribing to, do you see that? Realistically, do you see that?
I could share only my own experience, like we all. I don't know where we take our experience to read different articles or to be in different debates or to be in different meetings. I have my personal experience around this table, what you're just asking, EU Council table. I think in Bratislava, after that, when we take very seriously the two main topics, welfare and security, these are these main goals to achieve inside the EU. Now, the question about the unity. Of course, I understand that we have quite a lot different opinions. For example, 2 weeks ago when we were in Bulgaria, in Sofia, I am really happy that today we have this kind of format like Leaders' Agenda. And we decided it here in Thailand, 28th of September last year, that we need this kind of open debates. And we don't need any time this kind of final conclusions and concrete memorandums. Just to talk, just to find this kind of consensus. And of course, this Iran aspect, of course, the Paris Agreement, there are quite a lot hard questions between transatlantic relations. But my opinion is that EU must be also front runner, I mean to outside. For example, when we take the last year EU-African summit, EU Social Summit, what we had in Gothenburg, where we were together with you, I think this shows very strongly that Europe is not sleeping, but Europe is acting very, very actively. Of course, we understand that we aren't the United States of Europe. We are European Union, and that's quite a different organization. But this unity to find different consensus, to find the consensus, my point is that it is today very strong. Sorry, but in the leaders level, it's very strong. About this Macron speech, I think we could see today this kind of open debates, for example. It is concrete change in front of the European Parliament, where different leaders are coming, discussing and debating and answering the different questions. The second thing, about the security. I think the security and defense is so important issues also inside the Europe, not to build an, I don't know, the alternative for NATO, but to make this cooperation with NATO. And last 1.5 years, I could say this cooperation is very strong between NATO and the EU. We have very concrete projects together, I think more than 70, where the NATO and the EU are acting together. Doing different activities together. And it was also one of our priority during our presidency. Of course, I couldn't say today in front of this audience that everything is good, for example, in digital aspect. For us, it was and it's still very important. My opinion is that the attitude for the rest of the Europe is very positive. But if we are going to the details, how to solve this question or this initiative, then we have different opinions. For example, we are thinking here in Estonia that we really need the free movement of data. But I understand that it is now time to go to find a solution. I really hope that maybe it was very great when we decided it last year, but today we haven't this kind of solution yet. But the unity, to answer your question, the unity today, I don't know the new situation. I mean, from the Prime Minister from Spain and from the Prime Minister from Italy. But today the unity is so strong. Let's take one example more, the sanctions. All these 28 countries, they are behind the sanctions very strongly. I had been 3 times in this level inside these debates. Maybe there are different opinions, but the conclusion is the same, 100%.
And I was wondering, we've been 30 minutes into it. Russia hasn't come up yet, but we'll get to it. We'll get to it. I'm fairly certain. Very latest at the Q&A. I have no doubt about that. But I still want to pick up on what the Prime Minister said, Lolita Tsigane. He very much believes and has defended here once again that the Union is strong, that Europe is strong, notwithstanding the latest election in Italy and with resignation of the Spanish Prime Minister. Is that something you would subscribe to, or would you say it's a bit of a positive? Perhaps even, I won't say it, you say it.
Yes, I do subscribe to this idea that the European Union is as strong as it can be given the conditions and given the history and given what it is. And I do subscribe to the idea that difference of opinion does not mean that we have divisions. And this is a very important aspect to remember. For instance, now I'm part of the governing coalition in my country. If I all of a sudden would end up in the opposition and we would have the governing coalition in Latvia, which, God forbid, but would start attacking our courts, our media, civil society, I would encourage the European Commission to start a very active dialogue with our government to tell them not to go there. This is partly why I voted in the referendum for joining the European Union, so that we would entrench ourselves in democratic Western institutions so that it becomes irreversible. So I think this dialogue is very important, and we really need to go with it. One thing about the European Union that many people criticize is that it's too bureaucratic. And in the UK, of course, it at some point got quite as far as saying that the European Commission is just this faceless bureaucracy that prints laws. But I think that the Prime Minister very well described that this is actually not so. There are so many processes and working groups and different decision-making expert levels where decisions are being arrived to, compromises are being made, and it actually takes a lot of time. And I think that actually this big institutional apparatus very often works for the benefit of the European Union, because sometimes the events seem to overtake the whole process. For instance, the next day or during the next European Council after the Brexit referendum vote, the European Council confirmed the global strategy of foreign and defense policy and security policy. And some people said, "What are you doing? Are you crazy? This is a doomsday. The EU is falling apart. You are confirming this global strategy." But that was exactly the right decision, because the strategy was ready. We had set the date that it will be confirmed, and then we focused on the future. And on many aspects, for instance, now we are pulling our hair about trade relations with the US. At the same time, this EU integration process is ongoing. Just a few days ago in our committee, we were making decisions and scrutinizing the Latvian government position on the United Visa Code. We were looking in digital trade of goods and standardization. We were looking of how to protect children from being kidnapped if there is a marriage of nationals of two different countries. So this integration process is ongoing, no matter how fantastic crisis we might have at the global level, and that is good.
Before I go to question, I still want to give Tomasz Kleine-Brockhoff and Konrad Szymanski the opportunity to react to what they've heard so far. Tomasz Kleine-Brockhoff, I saw that you took diligent notes while the Prime Minister was speaking. I have a feeling you have a thing or two to say.
Yeah, I wanted a couple of questions to Konrad Szymanski. First is he seemed to assume that the agenda of President Macron is divisive, if I understood you correctly. I'd like to know from you how so. President Macron presented 71 proposals, of which about 10 of them would imply new European institutions. Multiple of them would imply treaty change. This, what we've seen there, is a big menu of options that has been on the table. So it's questionable to me. And by the way, one of the critiques of the speech of President Macron was that they didn't have a hierarchy. So it's my question to you would be, how do you take divisiveness out of that? Talking about divisiveness, I took from your interpretation that the clash of values is that the European Union and the European Commission seems to imply with regard to Poland is one big misunderstanding, and it's about implementation, and we're about to see that problem solved with regard to the legal system in Poland. I'm happy if that's the case. I'm hoping that's the case. Let's take Poland out of that picture for 1 second. But let's not overlook that we are in the European Union. One of the dividing lines is in our countries between liberal democracy and illiberal democracy. I think we have one prime minister in Europe, at least one, who prides himself as supporting a liberal democracy, and I think he has an ambition to make a renationalization of Europe the goal of the whole European Union. He now has reframed, Mr. Orban has reframed the summary line over his philosophy to mean Christian democracy. To me, that's not a return of into the haven of European classical Christian democracy, but rather a dog whistle. What he actually means with democracy is illiberal majoritarianism, and what he means with Christian is a wink and a nod to an anti-Muslim proposition to his voters. He's run a divisive, a culturalist, sometimes an anti-Semitic campaign, and he is betting on an alliance that today includes, or in his view, Vienna, Bavaria, with a few side offices, in his view, in maybe Rome or Warsaw. So this is what we have to look at as one of the dividing lines in Europe.
Right. Let's give Konrad Szymanski the opportunity to respond to what you said. So to Thomas Brockhoff, you downplayed the differences between Poland and the current problems between Poland and the EU at the moment. Your response?
No, I would like to put it into proportions because I feel responsible for the future of the European integration also in my country. So I would warn you not to go too far with this kind of definitions, dramatic definitions, that we are on the brink of the cultural or value war in Europe, because one day you can get what you think about, and it would be better to avoid. It's better to put proportions into such an unnecessary controversy like the problem of the understanding of the rule of law in Poland, and I think it's in our best interest to put it like this and not to go too far with the over-dramatized interpretation of the situation. Another dramatization we hear for some time today is the question of liberal democracy and its future. We know very well that Europe didn't start since the time of the Rome Treaty. It's a little bit longer story. And I think it is a valuable historical knowledge behind these problems we have today, and it's quite easy to understand that we have in the continent quite different political traditions, more individualistic, Anglo-Saxon, indeed liberal, in classical terms, liberal societies. One of them we are losing in the coming months, but also more communitarian-oriented, Mediterranean political philosophy. And it doesn't mean that any of those traditions would play any supremacy role in the contemporary Europe. EU is a mixture of all traditions, including the Christian democracy, conservatism, social democracy, etc. It doesn't mean that we have to do our best to make EU homogenized entity, because we have a different constitutional traditions, we have a different philosophical, political traditions, and it is a value. So I don't think we have any added value coming from the discussions, sometimes quite hostile or toxic discussions about the borders of the liberal democracy, and when we are moving toward illiberal democracy, whatever it means, it is, I think, unproductive, which we should be a little bit more inclusive, right, so and rather try to understand the different traditions than to exclude the different traditions and cultural trends.
So the accusations that are directed towards your government, as far as undermining the rule of law, curtailing freedom of speech, these are things that Europe is overblowing, are dramatizing. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly.
Yuri Ratas, I want to give you the opportunity to respond.
Thank you. I will meet tomorrow with my good colleague from Poland here in Tallinn. And of course, I could continue a little bit this debate, but I would like to say maybe some remarks more about the unity inside the EU. And I think that that is the question, how we are thinking. Is it that they are we, or we could say that it's us? And we often could understand that or thinking that what we are talking in Brussels, then it's the question, then what we are talking in our capitals. Is it the same aspects? Is it the same story, or it is the different story? And in Brussels we could say that the unity is so important, and we are here acting as a team, and when we are returned to our capitals, then we are saying that they are deciding there in Brussels or in Strasbourg and so on. I think that is one of very important thing, and my opinion is, of course, we must understand and talk in Brussels and in different capitals, us. The second question, or the second aspect, maybe once more, when we were in Vatican, and Pope Francis, I think he said very right thing, and he said that these differences, what we have, these differences is our strength. And I think that is very right, that we don't want to build one common, one state or one republic. We understand that.
But I don't think he was talking about those differences.
No. I just would like to add about the unity.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I have no doubt that we're going to have some questions from the audience. We have a great deal of expertise in the audience. Let's make use of it. Let's get a mic here in the second row. Jana is first up. Can we get her a microphone? And for those who don't know you, please introduce yourself quickly.
My name is Jana Puljerin. I work for the German Council on Foreign Relations in Berlin. And I have actually two questions, very quick ones. First one to the whole panel. So if there is a problem with democracy or backsliding democracy and rule of law, there are hardly any instruments for the European Union. I mean, there is this Article 7 procedure, but one of the recent proposals was coming from the Commission to strengthen the link between EU funding and rule of law. So what is your take on this? Do you think this is a good idea? And if not, what could be other tools? And the second question, I really support Thomas's point on the Eurozone and Germany, but I just remember that there was a letter of the 8 sorry, but dwarfs. That's or the Nordic states. That's in German media. It was referred to as the letter of the 8 dwarfs. The finance ministries, ministers from also the Baltic states, opposing anything that would go into the direction of a transfer union or anything that would accommodate Monsieur Macron when it comes to finance minister. So what is your take on Thomas's first proposal to...
And both questions are directed towards the Prime Minister?
No. First one is to all of the panel, and the second one just to the representatives from the Baltic states.
All right, let's hold those answers. Microphone in the back, please.
Kim Dozier, CNN. What do you think, to everyone at the panel, that President Trump's attitude towards Europe and the EU is doing in the minds of your populations, and how does that, how do you think that could reflect on their support for pro-US policies versus going in another direction?
Right, thank you so much. Let's take just one more question and get the answers, and then I'll open it up again, of course, before we wrap this thing up. We still have a good half hour to go. Go ahead, please.
Thank you. My name is Mike Haltzel. I'm from Johns Hopkins SAIS in Washington. Sort of two questions, but they relate to each other. It's about values. As an outsider, I would have to say I really have to subscribe completely to what Thomas was saying about values. It seems to me there is a minimum standard that every citizen must be able to claim as rights that is not debatable. It's not a question of interpretation. And I think that what he was saying shows that, but that's your internal affair, not so much mine. The question I would ask, though, is about values. One hears from Brussels constantly the phrase European values. That grates on American ears, I have to tell you. We think they're Western values, but fine. In the reaction to President Trump's imposition of tariffs, there's been some pretty amazing language from people like Mrs. Mogherini and Mr. Juncker about options for Europe, China, Russia. Excuse me, there's a contradiction there. If you really are so concerned about European values, the idea of aligning no matter what you think of the current US president, the idea of you're aligning with China or Russia, it seems to me, completely eliminates the argument for European values. Question, do you agree?
That's a sneaky way to squeeze in very well. Point well taken. Let's get the answers to those questions. Perhaps we'll start with you, Lolita Tsigane, this time. Perhaps the Baltic question that Jana was posing.
Yes, the question about transfer union and these 9 finance ministers being opposed to that. I think that the main actually issue and point of the finance ministers of 9 countries was that they are staunch supporters of fiscally responsible policies, and that we shouldn't be spending what we don't earn, basically. And we know that in order to coordinate the Eurozone policy, we invented something called the European semester. And actually all member states, and especially the Eurozone countries, receive so-called country-specific recommendations that talk about structural problems, unreformed fields in our economies where reforms haven't been accomplished. Unfortunately, there is no enforcement mechanism for that, and we just go on not really reforming important sectors of our economies. And this is what they spoke about, that we shouldn't be talking about transfer union before we actually decide that structural reforms need to be implemented. So reform first, and then think about potential transfer union or whatever we might refer to. So I think this is a very important clarification that we need to make. And when it comes to the rule of law question, I think that it is justified to tie rule of law questions with the structural funding. The procedure that the Commission is proposing, in my opinion, is not a good procedure. And that procedure is risking of creating new divisions because it is proposing this reverse majority where the Commission decides. I think that this question should be referred to the court, and the court should decide if there are basic parameters of rule of law that are probably in danger, then the court should be deciding whether there should be this link with structural funding made. And the last point about infringement on freedoms and values. I think that the Estonian president yesterday made an excellent point where she talked about people coming from the southern Ukrainian territories of Donbass under occupation, and she said that she can instinctively feel fear. I think that we who have been living, at least for some, no matter how small, but some part of our lives in the totalitarian system, we know what an attack to basic freedom is, and we feel it. We feel it intuitively.
Thank you. Thomas Steiner-Brockhoff, much agreement with what you've been saying up until now. Of course, those questions were implanted.
No, first of all, Western values, European values, Mike, agree completely. There are no European values. Never at any time have those values that we're talking about been encompassing all of Europe. And they've always had a Western core, an Atlantic core. So I think the pitch for Western values as opposed to European values is well taken. Kim Dozier's question: does Trump's attitude pull into other directions? Yes, of course it does. I mean, there's enough people in our countries, in some countries more than in others, that are confronted with something that they don't like, which is powerlessness vis-a-vis this assault, so to say, and are thinking about the exits. I find that completely irresponsible, but that's what Mr. Trump is starting. He will, of course, have people think about hedging, about counterbalancing, and you do that with the other powers that be. Now, Mike, that these maybe authoritarian countries is not a surprise. Those are the ones that be, and we have to be realistic. Saudi Arabia has been a Western ally for quite some time, and we haven't thought about it. So let's not be holier than thou, but let's think about the democratic values inside of our community, upholding them there. So I don't quite see it as such a contradiction as I think you're making out to be. So to the question of the instruments that Jana asked, I actually like the instrument that is being proposed by the Commission to connect structural funds to rule of law, because not only do you have you're going to have people in our countries who feel that with their tax money to support governments that have less than a stellar record on the rule of law, I can picture a lot of people who say, not with my money. And that I think that regulation would take account of that we have a basic minimum standard, and that countries are sovereign in their conduct, but structural funds of the European Union are joint tax income.
Prime Minister, I'm going to give you the final word here, but I do want to bring in Konrad Szymanski, particularly on the instruments question.
Why particularly?
Why? I think you and I know why, at the end of the day, because those instruments, of course, would be applied against your country.
No, I have to assure you that the European Commission made a lot of efforts to explain to the public opinion that it is not a Polish case. So you do something probably unwelcomed by our Brussels colleagues, presenting this initiative as as an instrument to tackle with a so-called Polish problem. But seriously, I can agree with any kind of conditionality, because I can only agree that the payers, and we are all payers, by the way, that the payers deserve the transparent architecture of control of every single euro spent, EU euro, spent in our countries. And Poland spent a lot of money, EU money as well, spent very properly. We spent more than average. We have a very good statistic. And we have one of the highest standards in terms of anti-fraud and corruption, anti-corruption standards in spending EU money. So we have no problem with conditionality as a matter of principle. Where we see a slightly problematic accent in this whole proposition is the fact that European Commission would like to be a body, an institution, which would conclusively assess the constitutional affairs in the member states. I'm not very sure if it's in line with the treaty, because we have no problem with the legally binding judgments of the ECJ, sometimes with financial consequences. No doubt, there's no controversy about it. But this is exactly where we need a court, an independent body, not the executive body. Try to imagine the situation, the parallel situation in your member states, where the executive body would make conclusive decisions about your rights and obligations in things like money. I think it would be a major problem of unaccountability. And here we have a problem of unaccountability, and we have a problem of the legal base. But we are patient. We will proceed with this proposition according to the rules, mentioning this aspect. But it is not, again, it is not a principle discussion about conditionality and clear rules and guarantees and control of the EU money. It should be done like this, because I understand this is the precondition to understand the MFF challenges in all our member states. And we see very clearly that insurgency in the north is mainly about the transfer, all kinds of transfers. It is, of course, populist insurgency, but it is a matter of fact. I can only agree that you can't defend Western values, and I would subscribe to this concept because I believe in the unity of the West. Not the EU is very important, from my perspective, the most important part, but the part of the West. You can't defend the Western values and offer the partnership to China or Russia. And the statement made by some Brussels gentlemen should be read in a context of many other statements where the major figures in Brussels offered a real political revival of partnership to Russia. Exactly during the time of war in Ukraine, in Donbass, exactly in the time of consecutive trade hostile measures against the member states. I think it is totally out of touch with European reality. And this is exactly the example how not to form a European unity. This is not this kind of unity we need. We need a unity based on the interests, values, and opinions of all people around the table. Balanced approach, and this is an example of something absolutely unbalanced.
Right. Prime Minister.
The first question about democracy, rule of law, and Article 7. I think here is the most important thing that the Commission and Poland, they continue the discussions and debate. I think we don't want to see that we really will take some votes from our table. And I think that is the very bad situation if it will happen. And I really hope that today's chance to find a solution about that. For us, if we are talking the rule of law, of course, it is very important aspect and value in EU. The second question about the finance minister. I think it isn't a question about the position that we need this kind of common EU finance minister. I think much more important is the question how we are reacting under different regulations and meanings about our budget. It is the question about the public debt, it is a question about the budget balance and so on. I think these are much more important than do we have one person more or we don't. About the tariffs and the United States, of course the situation is bad, but the transatlantic relations for us, I mean also for the EU and including Estonia, they are very strategic. And I really hope that we could find here the solution not the short term, but the long term. Today's situation, like I said, is bad. Of course, the Europe must react also, but I really hope that both parts, EU and United States, we understand very soon that these bridges or these ties are much more important than the situation what we have today. And if I could say, you said no, or yes or no, I think here is the answer is only talk, talk, and talk.
Just quickly before I take another round of questions, you said the relationship between EU and the US is as vital as ever in light of the many challenges. Chancellor Merkel, of course, she said the times where we Europeans can rely on the US may be over. Perhaps it's time that we make sure that we rely on ourselves. So you disagree with the German Chancellor?
I just met the 10 congressmen in Tallinn about 2 hours ago. And I said to them, how strategical are these relations between, for example, EU and United States, between in our region, I mean in the Baltic States region plus Poland. This commitment, if we are talking to defense and security, they are so important for us. I couldn't say that now these relations are over and it doesn't matter what happened. These are strategic relations what we must keep. And if we have, I don't know, vulnerabilities or this kind of problems on the table, then we must solve these questions.
Well, the 10 congressmen don't seem to be the problem, but the point is well taken, ladies and gentlemen. Let's take in more questions here. We had the gentleman had his hand up for quite some time, and then go in the middle. Go ahead, please.
Thanks. Jerker Hellström. I had the Asia program at the Swedish Defense Research Agency. I'd like to pick up on China. China is obviously establishing partnerships, sub-regional partnerships around Europe, where the flagship one is the 16+1 of 11 EU member states and 5 non-EU member states in Central and Eastern Europe, which has led to some concern in Brussels that China is trying to influence policy. Chancellor Merkel warned Beijing in February that it should not link investment to political interest, particularly when it comes to the Belt and Road Initiative. She's not the only one who's concerned. We all know about Chinese influence operations in Australia and New Zealand. My question then is Europe not an issue here? Now that we have 3 representatives on the stage for 3 of the 16 countries in the 16+1 framework, I'd like to ask, I mean, of course, Chinese investment is required. We are interested in attracting Chinese investment, but to what extent is China's sharp power a challenge for EU cohesion, especially when it comes to values?
Right. China is on the mind of this young gentleman, and you'll get a chance to respond. Quentin, did you have your hand up? Quentin Peel. Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Ali. Quentin Peel from Chatham House. As I think I may have been the guilty man who planted the idea in Ali's mind that Brexit is not over yet, I'd just very quickly like to follow that up by saying it's an extraordinary situation in the United Kingdom of sort of national psychological meltdown that we're going through. With a government that is totally divided and an opposition that is totally divided, and the little English nationalist party UKIP that launched the whole process towards a referendum that has collapsed. And it's actually going nowhere. So I think there is a genuine chance that Brexit could be in some way halted, and I would like that idea to be taken on board. The second thought that I would like to come to, however, is the nightmare of direct democracy. I do not subscribe to the belief that this was a wonderful democratic decision. It was a moment of just sort of national craziness. But it's direct democracy that's the problem. Over my rather long journalistic career, I've covered almost every referendum in the European Union, and on almost every occasion, the result was decided on something that wasn't on the order paper. In the case of Brexit, it was very clearly that immigration was a huge issue. And so one of the problems, one of the challenges, I think, to Europe is the growing use of referendums and direct democracy, fueled in part by the internet. And final thought on the subject is this, and I think this is where those of us who do believe passionately in that Europe is great need to recognize nonetheless that it has been very often the greatest, if you like, strides forward in Europe that have equally created some of the greatest tensions. The creation of the single market, arousing a lot of feeling in different countries that, hey, we're giving up our high standards, or hey, we're being forced to take, you know, bad beer or bad chocolate or whatever else. The single currency, the common currency, again, raising tensions by both by being a great advance, but by creating tensions. Schengen, opening of borders without the strengthening of the external borders, and indeed, finally, enlargement itself, which the old member states seemed to think was all going to be a problem for the new member states and wouldn't affect the old member states at all. And in a way, it's not realizing that that was also going to be a huge challenge in the old member states, which I think has undermined the process, or undermined public support for the process.
Right. Thank you, Quentin. A lot of food for thought, as we're used to it from you. Can we get the microphone to the lady in the back? I have you on my side. Don't worry about it. Go ahead, please.
Gu Chunji from China Xinhua News Agency. About the question about China, how do you think of the mutually benefit effect between the China and the European and Europe? And do you agree the stronger China is, the stronger Europe is? Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much. Can we get the microphone to the gentleman here in the second row? He's been very patient. Please, let's keep the questions brief and keep the answers brief. We have 13 minutes left to go.
Sergei Tsiplev, St. Petersburg, Russian Academy for National Economy and Public Administration. You know, it is a little bit strange that we are discussing Great Europe, not mentioning Russia at all. In previous time, we have mentioned a lot as a big and dangerous threat for the whole Europe. Looking strategically, I can say that in long-term perspective, Russia has two main options. Options number one, a great Sweden. You are a lone regional power, remembering old glory times. And option number two, come closer to Euro-Atlantic world, to be, for example, a member of NATO, and so on and so on. And my question is a general question. Are European politicians ready to construct the strategic policy, not expecting Russia as an unavoidable threat or and today's enemy, and not only, but also a future ally?
All right, thank you so much. To conclude and wrap up the Q&A, the gentleman here raising his hand in the third row. We're going to combine the questions and answers in just a moment. Let's keep it brief. You're up.
Absolutely. Andrew Mick, the Marshall Center. We've heard a lot about unity. One of the most polarizing issues in Europe that also connects to Russia and connects to the US is Nord Stream 2. I'd like the panel to comment, if possible, A, on the feasibility that the project will in fact proceed as it seems to be going right now, and B, if that's the case, what are the consequences for European unity going forward and also for the transatlantic relationship?
Right.
And the third question, if the project is not to proceed, what is the strategy that the Europeans are interested in pursuing to end that project, and at what price? Thank you.
Right, thank you so much. We have a little over 10 minutes to go, so you don't feel obliged to answer to all questions, only the ones that you feel are pertinent to your field and country. Lolita Tsigane, why don't you get started?
Right, we'll start with 16+1, China and Central and East European countries. Latvia does participate. Our neighbor, Belarus, is a very active participant. They are receiving a lot of Chinese investments. And of course, this makes this project of regional importance, and we of course want to be part in it. I do not see any direct dangers to the European unity from this project, but I think that one very important aspect that we have to bear in mind is absolute transparency. We have to be transparent of what's going on and what's happening. And this brings me to the question about Nord Stream 2. We oppose and have always opposed the Nord Stream 2 project. We do not think it's economically feasible. It will not create a new gas supply to the European Union, but just will create an alternative route that will bypass Ukraine. So we are both punishing Ukraine and also creating a new channel of dependency on the Russian gas. But we haven't managed to do much about it, although it seems that by spirit, the third energy package should include this project, and thus there should be much more consent from the European Commission. This does not seem to be the interpretation of the current letter of the regulation. So we keep struggling, but also here, if it's inevitable and Nord Stream 2 is going to go forward, same issue, transparency, maximum transparency of what is happening. But of course, we will be opposing it. And the last thing about Russia, we have 300 kilometers border with Russia, so this is an important neighbor to us. And our approach that we have taken in the Latvian parliament is that it is wrong to equate the whole Russia with Putin. And it is very wrong to think that everyone in Russia represents Putin's views and positions. For this reason, we have created a cooperation group with democratic opposition and civil society in Latvian parliament with the Russian democratic opposition and civil society. And we are trying to give our support to the Russian civil society to the extent possible. And all the Baltic countries do, and I hope you feel it, our Russian colleagues who value this cooperation and will definitely try to do more.
All right, thank you so much. Mr. Prime Minister, you will get the last word. Konrad Szymanski, then we'll hear from Thomas Kleiner-Brockhoff, and then you will bring this panel home, Mr. Prime Minister. Konrad Szymanski.
No, I wonder if it's liberal or illiberal to continue deliberations about any possible limitations of direct democracy if it's offer unnecessary or unwelcome result. But we have no time to such a deliberations. But I think it's a very good example of the questions we face, especially in the digital age, how to apply our obvious pillars, rules, principles in the modern world. And we haven't too many answers, to be honest. We have more questions than answers what to do with the contemporary state of democracy in contemporary society. But I would like to put my attention to the Nord Stream 2, because it is a very interesting case. Nord Stream 2, according to the plans, is obviously against any European strategy agreed by the heads of governments, heads of state, ministers for some years. It is obviously against the European model of gas market, which should be competitive, open, customer-oriented, etc. We invested a lot, both political, but also money, to interconnectors, to the development of the gas infrastructure, to make this market, especially in our part of Europe, which is undeveloped because of political and historical reasons, we invested a lot to make this market open and competitive. With the Nord Stream 2 completed, it means that in all parts of this very sophisticated architecture of the gas system in Central Europe, we would have exactly the same gas. I'm not very sure if it's in line with the market-oriented logic behind the European strategies agreed by all member states. Of course, it poses enormous strategic risk for Ukraine. It is no doubt that Russia would go further with the hostile war intentions against Ukraine. It means against our own security, because Ukraine is our neighbor and it is not neutral for Europeans. What is going on in Ukraine? It's not so far from our borders. So I think it is pretty clear that EU should stop its very unnecessary silence about this investment and start thinking how to apply the EU legal agreed regime. And I think this hard opposition against application of the EU law in this very investment is a final proof that it is not an investment based on business foundations. Just opposite. This investment is possible only with a political guarantees and political privileges offered to Russia by some European leaders.
Thank you to Konrad Szymanski. Thomas Steiner-Brockhoff.
Okay, I'll leave the China question to the elected leaders, and so I will with the Russias, but I will take on the Nord Stream and the democracy. Nord Stream. I've always wondered what the German interest in this was. I've never understood why this was construed to be simply an economic project. Given the interests of Germany's neighbors in it, it cannot be just an economic project. I'm not sure it can at this point be prevented. Permits have been issued. The interpretation that Konrad Szymanski said about European law and the applicability diverge. The economic elements that you mentioned, well, it is well understood that Poland wants to be an energy hub in the region. There, I can see an element of competition between Poland and Germany. The Chancellor has taken an initiative to address the Ukrainian concerns that I think she shares with you and others. I've always understood her position on this as she was able to, in the domestic system, to support Russia sanctions, but she was not able to do both in the domestic theater. So that's just my personal interpretation of why something, in my view, is so fundamentally, the outcome was so different than I would interpret a German national interest. So you asked, Andrew, about the transatlantic consequences of this. As you can tell from what I'm saying, I'm very critical and opposed to this pipeline. If the United States were to issue sanctions on it, I would turn into proponent of it. Because as much as I'm opposed to this project, I'm more opposed to the infringement on German sovereignty by the United States.
May I make one comment on the Ukrainians' guarantees? Very short.
But very short.
Very short.
Extremely short.
Ukrainians got a piece of paper from some of us, at least, from us, let's say from Europe, in 1997, with tremendous consequences for today. And you are offering them another piece of paper, so-called the guarantees for the use of the gas transfer system.
All right.
Short.
Mr. Prime Minister.
Yeah. Thank you. The first question was about 16+1 and China. I think today we have in EU different formats. Also, we have the Nordic-Baltic format under the 6 countries and under the 8 countries. And important is how we use these formats and what we say there. And I mean by that, if we follow EU common policy, then I think we could use this kind of different formats, and I confirm that Estonia does it. The second aspect was about the Brexit, and the question was that, or this remark was that the Brexit is going nowhere. And if the Brexit is going nowhere, then the question is, what will be the solution? And if we haven't the solution, then I think when the people decided from United Kingdom that they need or support Brexit, then it is only possibility that they could decide it once again. But what I said before, that of course I'm much more interested in personally that UK is stay in EU. I think it's much more better all of the countries. About the Nord Stream 2, I think the main question is Why? Today, Nord Stream 1 working, and like I understand, there is more capacity to use it, Nord Stream 1. Why do we need this Nord Stream 2? It's totally political project and question. Of course, it's very important that if this Nord Stream 2 or 2 is coming, that it must be under EU energy policy. And I 100% agree, Lolita, what you said about this Nord Stream 2.
So, Prime Minister, before we wrap this up, I had the pleasure of moderating a talk with legendary Harvard professor Joseph Nye at the GlobSec Forum, and he drove home a point from an American perspective very fairly. He's always peculiarly interested and puzzled by why does Europe make itself smaller than it is. He would like to see a Europe that's much more self-confident about its accomplishments, about its soft power, and so on and so forth. Does Europe make itself smaller than it is?
I think what I said before, that the Europe is today quite different parts, this kind of front runner, or be in front, I mean the Paris Agreement. Also, if we are talking between the relations to continent, EU and Africa, when we are talking the rule of law, I couldn't say that Europe is smaller, or we are talking that Europe is smaller than actually the Europe is. I think today Europe is very strongly together and acting together as a team. And I think that is, in the worldwide, the most important part, that also our economy is growing stronger, improving, better figures. I think it shows that these 28 countries or 27 countries are very strong part. And of course, the question is always what is this kind of interest in. For example, if we're talking digitalization, then what are the alternatives? What are the alternative markets, what they are doing? I think we must be here, this kind of front-runner and proactive part of the rest of the world.
And you are optimistic about the future of this union?
I couldn't believe that the leader from EU countries could be pessimistic. Of course, I am optimistic.
Ladies and gentlemen, on that positive and optimistic note, Lolita Tsigane, Konrad Szymanski, Tomasz Kleiner-Brockhoff, and of course Prime Minister Jüri Ratas, many thanks for a very substantial discussion on the future of Europe. How great is Europe, we will see, but the optimism we will take with us from this panel. So thank you, and let's give another final round of applause to this wonderful panel. Thank you.